Evolution, Chapter 38, Foreign Politics. Jen didn't like getting involved in Earth politics. It could be sticky. Honestly, any political situation could get sticky. But the King of Zarkovia had contacted the UN and requested Jen's assistance. Apparently, his son had gotten a hold of a dangerous alien that Jen had tangled with before. Dr. Victor was a Transcellian that Gwen and Jen had tangled with back when they were kids. He had originally resurrected Ghost Freak, but was formidable on his own. They'd agreed to come collect the convict, as he'd ended up in the Null Void at some point since Jen had seen him last. Apparently, Kevin had run into him there.
Yeah, he's a real tough customer.
Jen nodded as they flew into Zarkovian airspace. Getting their asses handed to them by Dr. Victor, who was under the control of King Zarian's son, Prince Gulia, was almost embarrassing. Gwen shook her head as she woke up. Jen was hanging next to her on the wall, Kevin chained nearby in a chair. All of them had power dampeners on. These devices were things she'd only seen through her research into plumber tech. They looked like thick gold circlets with a red gem in the center, but were far more complex than that. Gwen shook her head again. What happened? She wasn't really expecting an answer. Jen and Kevin were still out cold, but she got one as a weak voice came from the rack in front of her. My son has betrayed me, usurped my throne, and left me to rot in my own dungeon. Gwen spotted King Zarian chained there. She glanced at Kevin and Jen. Neither of them had stirred yet. She managed to let off a blast of power to free the king, but soon wished she hadn't. He stepped over to the controls and released Jen, who fell as though boneless to the floor. The king smiled. Gwen frowned as he pulled a syringe from under his cloak. What are you doing? The king smiled up at her. What I planned since my son revealed his weapon to me. I needed a source of power to complete the transfer, and she has several transformations that will suffice. He slipped the needle into Jen's neck and injected the liquid within. Gwen pulled at her restraints, but she'd used what little energy she could get at to free the king. He smiled at her as he pulled the needle out of her cousin. Fear not, it's just a sedative. I need her alive. For now. He picked her up by the back of her jacket and dragged her to the door, which was opened by a palace guard. Take her to the lab. The guard nodded and hefted Jen over one shoulder. The king nodded at Gwen in mocking respect. Thank you, my dear. He closed and locked the door behind him. Gwen screamed in rage, her power bubbling under her skin, unable to escape. Kevin jerked awake, blinking hard. What did I miss? He blinked, looking around, confused. King Zarian is going to use Jen as a power source. We need to get out of here. Kevin swore and tried to absorb the metal of his bindings, only for nothing to happen. Power dampeners. Great. He wiggled his hands and managed to get a few fingers under his sleeve. He pulled and came away with a bobby pin in between his fingers. He managed to wiggle it into the keyhole, and in moments he had one hand loose. He ripped off the power dampener and absorbed the metal of his cuff, ripping it apart. He pulled Gwen's power dampener off as well. There was a minor explosion as her pent-up energy was released, but Kevin managed to dodge the shrapnel as they raced off to find Jen. They found her, still out cold, in a rig Kevin identified as an energy transference setup. King Asshat used her to power the damn thing. He growled as he pulled her free and began gently smacking her in the face. Come on, wake up. Gwen frowned. He sedated her, Gwen said, kneeling next to her supine cousin. Kevin glanced at the Ultimatrix. Turn it to swamp fire. She should be able to purge it from her system. Gwen glanced at the Ultimatrix. Kevin glanced at her. I'd do it myself, but I'm never touching that thing again. Not unless the universe is at stake. Gwen nodded and turned the dial on the Ultimatrix to what she thought was swamp fire. Slapping down the dial, however, resulted in molten slag and crackling lava rocks covering Jen as they both scrambled away from her. As it turned out, when Pyronites threw up, it came out as literal lava, burning a hole in the floor of the lab as Heat Blast shook her head, sitting up. I hate today. Gwen laughed as they pulled themselves to their feet and took off after Dr. Victor. This time, their victory was concise. Jen took the mind control device from the prince and turned it off before smashing the controls. Since the mind in charge of Dr. Victor was technically human, they left him behind, covered head to foot in dried molten slag. The people of Zarkovia would decide their own fate, and it didn't look like they would be siding with the insane king or despotic prince anytime soon. Jen fell asleep on the way back to Bellwood, and Gwen took Kevin's hand and squeezed it. He smiled at her as he steered the ship.
Everything okay?
She nodded. Yeah, everything's fine. For once, he sort of believed her. This had been a bit of an odd mission, but odd missions were old hat for them at this point. Gwen leaned forward again. Listen, I wanted to talk to you. Kevin felt his heart drop. Was she breaking up with him? I applied to graduate early, and they think I might walk the stage as soon as December if I play my cards right. Kevin frowned. This was in no way what he was expecting, as Gwen glanced over at her snoring cousin to make sure she was truly asleep. I would be going to the East Coast for college. There's a few Ivy League schools I've got my eyes on, and I wanted to know if you wanted to come with me. Kevin blinked.
You still want me around? Even after...
He cut himself off. He didn't really want to remind her of everything he'd done, both to her and her cousin. Gwen pecked him on the cheek. I thought I made it clear that I want you around. He grinned, leaning in for a real kiss.
I've never been to the East Coast. Should be fun.
She smiled at him and pulled him into another kiss. He only pulled away when the controls beeped at him for flying a little too close to a mountain. He turned just in time, and Gwen glanced at Jen, who had thankfully buckled herself in. The redhead snorted as her cousin kept snoring. I swear if someone didn't wake her up, she'd sleep through the end of the world. Kevin glanced at her.
Yeah, what about her? She's not graduating early.
Gwen shook her head. No, but Grandpa Max is looking into getting her a new partner, so if he asks you to look over a rookie file, that's what that's about. Kevin nodded.
It'll have to be someone with the patience of a saint.
Gwen laughed, nodding. Chapter 39, Tip-Off. Jen grinned as Pierce loaded a few more Forever Nights into the back of the ship. Kevin glanced around.
Remind me how we knew they'd be here.
He asked, and Jen grinned. I have my sources. She grinned as she got into her car, taking off before he could ask more. She stopped off at a burger shack and picked up some dinner before heading out of town. She arrived at her destination and hopped out of the car, a smile on her face as she slipped into the apartment building. She hopped up the stairs and knocked on the door. It was answered quickly by a plump woman in a very nice dress. Jen, thank you so much for babysitting tonight. No one else will. Jen shrugged at Jimmy's mother. No problem, Mrs. Jones. Jimmy's safe with me. Mrs. Jones smiled and finished pinning her hair up in the hallway mirror. Have fun on your date, Mom, Jimmy called out from his room, and Jen stepped into the apartment. I'll be back before 10. He's already had dinner. Don't let him fill up on sweets. Jen nodded and headed off towards the kid's room. You can count on me, Mrs. J. She smiled as she left, and Jen knocked on Jimmy's door. He grinned as he pulled it open. Oh, good, you're here. It's about to start. Jen laughed as he ushered her inside the room and then sat down in his desk chair. He flipped on his computer and picked up his keyboard. Jen laughed as he began to play his match. Jimmy Jones was a longtime player in an MMORPG that Jen had been amused to find also housed quite a few Forever Nights. It was exceedingly amusing because not only was it a fantasy RPG, but they tended to talk about work, no matter what. Jimmy Jones had been playing so long that many of the knights told him whatever he wanted to know for a chance at the legendary gear he offered. Today's raid was going particularly well, which meant the knights would be in a talking mood. So Jen pulled out the field notebook she'd been reading. She flipped it back open to the last entry and frowned. The child is proving difficult to speak to. It is not that she is from a different land, though that does seem to be the case, but she seems unwilling to speak. Perhaps the shock of the battle with the Dagon is too much for her. Jen raised an eyebrow. This knight clearly didn't have faith in young alien women. Though since Jen had no idea how old the knight's daughter had been when she died, she had no idea how old this alien was. Jen shrugged and kept reading.
She wears clothes like those I've never seen in my life. Her manner of speech is odd as well, though she has no trouble understanding us. She seems to know not how she arrived here, but the shadows in her eyes speak of betrayal of the highest order. Many of the knights believe that since she bears the swordsmith's mark, she is my responsibility. I feel they are right, but that decision is down to the king.
Jimmy cheered, and Jen looked up, a small smile on her face. Nice, we beat it! Jen held back a laugh, knowing Jimmy had his microphone on. That was awesome, yeah! Jimmy nodded, grabbing his notebook and scribbling down a few things. He held up his notes, and Jen grinned. There were details and addresses. She shot him the thumbs up, and he signed off his game. You're the best, Jimmy. How's school? He frowned. Well, I like English class, but I'm having problems in science. Jen grinned. I can help with that. Jen said, grinning and stepping over to him. He pulled out his homework. Jimmy Jones was inquisitive at best, nosy at worst. But as it turned out, that was probably a good thing, if seeing Jen talk to a literal eyeball plant was anything to go by. There was a weird pod on the wall, too, but Jimmy was more focused on the fact that the plant seemed to be telling Jen what to do, and worse, she was listening. He ran to the nearest people he knew who could help. But though Gwen was nice as always, both of them wrote him off as just a kid who didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't want to go to the news, not after what had happened with half the media painting Jen as a bad guy when he revealed her identity. So he looked up the current address of the Rust Bucket, the infamous home of Maxwell Tennyson. Jen had told him a few stories about her grandfather, but he seemed most likely to be able to help. He found the Rust Bucket, but the man wasn't there. Instead, one of Jen's friends he hadn't met yet was. He was tall, with spikes growing out of his skin and a white stripe in his dark hair. He blinked at Jimmy, glancing at his jacket and raising an eyebrow at him. Can I help you? Jimmy nodded. I hope so. I'm looking for Max Tennyson. I have an alien problem. Max is at headquarters, but I'm a plumber. I may be able to help you. Jimmy nodded and came into the RV. Pierce wasn't sure how to deal with this kid. He'd heard about him from Jen, a smart little 10-year-old who'd worked out her identity from the Weird World website he ran. But it was plumber code to help those in need, and the kid looked beyond freaked out. He sat down at the table and Pierce opened the fridge. Can I offer you a drink? We have milk, soda, orange juice, and he pulled a carton out of the back of the fridge that had writing on it he didn't recognize. Questionable alien stuff that I'm not touching without Max around. Jimmy nodded. Jimmy shook his head. No time. There's something wrong with Jen. She's working with an alien conspiracy. Pierce raised an eyebrow and sat down across from him. Okay, tell me what you know. Jimmy blinked. You're actually going to listen? He sounded astonished. Pierce nodded. It's my job, kid. I'm a plumber. Jimmy smiled and started his tale with the meteor he'd heard a rumor about. It had turned out to be a plant. He'd gone straight to Jen like she'd asked him to, but Gwen and Kevin had had other things to do, so she'd taken him to check it out herself. But she'd been inside the cave too long, so he'd gone in to make sure she was all right and found her talking to the plant thing. And she said, your wish is my command, but she sounded like a zombie. Pierce nodded. Calm down, kid. We're going to make sure she's okay. Look, let me make a call real quick. He pulled a badge out of his pocket and tapped the side. It lit up and beeped for a minute. Hello? The voice was unfamiliar to Jimmy, but Pierce smiled. Hey, Magister Tennyson. It's Pierce. I'm going to go check out a tip outside of town. Have you heard from Jen recently, like in the last few hours? There was a pause. Yeah, actually, yes. She was asking if I'd seen the reporter kid, Jimmy Jones. Seemed a bit off, though. Probably hasn't been sleeping again. Pierce nodded. Maybe. I'll call you after. I can send Gwen and Kevin for backup. They're here. Looking for Jimmy, too, actually. Hang on. He must have handed the badge over to Kevin because his was the next voice to come out of the badge. Pierce, have you seen the kid? Pierce frowned. Kevin didn't normally sound like that, his tone almost robotic. No? Why? Gwen seemed to have taken the badge.
Are you sure? Jen wanted us to find him.
Jimmy shook his head at Pierce. Pierce nodded slightly. You realize I've never met the kid, right? But I'll keep an eye out. Hey, where is Jen anyway? There was a pause.
She went to check out a cave Jimmy thought was suspicious again. She didn't find anything last time, but she does like to be thorough.
Kevin said, and Pierce nodded. Cool. I'll see you guys around. Pierce hung up and Jimmy stared.
Why'd you lie for me?
Pierce shook his head. Kevin doesn't normally talk like that. Something's up. Where's this cave? Finding 3 pods where there had been one on the wall of the cave with a much bigger plant was scary. Hearing Jen talk to the thing as they snuck into the room was worse. The original is failing, she said as she eyed one of the pods. From here, they couldn't quite make out what was in them. The eye on the giant plant alien twitched, and Jen turned towards it. I do not know, Master. It began when we removed the Ultimatrix from her. Pierce swore under his breath. One of the spikes on his arm grew longer, and he snapped it off and twirled it. Maybe they know. They were tossed from behind by Kevin and Gwen. They landed in front of the pods, and Jimmy looked up and gasped. Gwen, Kevin, and Jen were trapped in the pods in front of them, and Jen looked very pale, even through the purple film on the pod. Pierce leapt to his feet and attacked. Jimmy scrambled away, and several packs of peanuts fell from his bag. One of them was open, spilling its contents out over the vines feeding into the pods. They burned, and Jimmy thought fast, snatching up a package and ripping it open, tossing the peanuts at the pods. It burned through, and Gwen and Kevin stumbled out of the pods. Jen just fell, barely catching herself on her hands as she coughed. Jimmy ran up to her.
Are you okay, Miss Tennyson?
He asked as Jen used him to pull herself up.
Not particularly, but I will be as soon as I get the Ultimatrix back.
It took a few minutes for her to do that, but once she did and Jimmy tossed his backpack full of peanuts down the plant thing's throat, the fight was over quickly. Jen pulled Jimmy aside. Look, I trust you, but no one can know that taking off the Ultimatrix is that dangerous. Jimmy nodded. She looked much better. All the color had returned to her face and her nose had stopped bleeding.
I swear, Miss Tennyson.
She smiled at him and ruffled his hair. Good. Thanks, Jimmy. Now, let's get you home. Your mom's probably worried about you.